Hi, everyone. Perfect. So let me start with a simple observation. When a bank finances a generation project and when a developer commits capital to a battery, when makers decide the timing of coal retirements, all those decisions are being made not by observing the physical grid, but through models. The energy market models sit behind almost every major decision in the electricity sector. They shape how investors perceive risk, how planners are anticipating the shortages, and how operators prepare for volatility. So what does that mean? It means that as the power system becomes more weather dependent and more flexible, the quality of those models will become increasingly more important. So today I'm going to talk about how long-term and medium-term forecasting using plexus is evolving in order to deal with this new complexity. So if we think of how the market forecasting is typically done, and this is through the context of an investor or for a bank or for a developer, usually we have those long-term electricity market forecasts that are produced using detailed simulation models such as Plexus. There are others, they're just not as good. So these models simulate market outcomes over long horizons, usually 20 to 30 years. And this is the time frame that broadly aligns with the economic life of most new generation and storage. The modelers usually construct a limited number of deterministic scenarios that do represent plausible futures. In practice, this often means that we converge towards a base case and then a high and a low sensitivity around the key drivers such as demand growth and main policy assumptions. Within each scenario, most input variables are typically represented using average expected conditions. The renewable output, the demand profiles, even generator availability reflect system normal behavior. Statistical outliers are often avoided because they just skew the deterministic forecast. I've been doing modeling for more than 15 years, so I've spent a lot of time trying to take out this outcome of volatility that just didn't fill those average conditions. So each scenario produces typically just one single price trajectory, where averaged inputs and in some cases, deliberate smoothing reduce the visibility of any short-term and even long-term volatility and extreme events. The result is typically a small set of plausible futures describing what the expected evolution of the market will be. The limitation of those deterministic scenarios is that they do not show how sensitive those outcomes are to small changes in some of the key inputs. A small shift in renewable production, in demand conditions, or in generator availability can create a very different outcome from the one that deterministic scenario modeling shows us. So it hides the dispersion around that average price that we get. So in other words, those long-term typical models describe the expected future, but they provide very limited insight into the range of possible deviations around that expectation. In electricity markets, it is often that those deviations from the average are the ones that determine the asset value, specifically for battery storage. So as the power system becomes more dependent on variable generation and weather conditions, understanding those range of outcomes becomes increasingly more important. So why do we think that those deterministic forecasts are falling short in that new system? Imagine that the demand that we usually use for that modeling, they follow very typical patterns. The renewables produce at expected modeled levels, generator outages follow normal schedules, and the constraints are only system normal constraints. Also, the weather conditions should be mild, because as I said, if they're extreme, then they might skew the results. So under those assumptions, the market appears relatively stable. The prices, as we move forward, they just evolve smoothly. That has worked relatively well in the existing system, the historical one, that was dominated by dispatchable generation, and the load was mostly passive and inflexible. However, we have that emerging electricity system that behaves quite differently. The weather variability now is one of the primary drivers of price formation. We have wind droughts, solar variability, and coincident demand peaks that can rapidly tighten the supply-demand balance. And at the same time, thermal retirements will even further reduce the system's buffer. And as the remaining coal fleet ages, we're going to have unplanned outages that will become more frequent and even less predictable. Also, the transmission constraints are becoming more complex. And as the system shifts from large concentrated thermal plants to geographically dispersed renewable generation, this becomes even more complicated as well. Finally, the demand is changing. It's not inflexible anymore. We have electrification, load growth data centers, and demand response that create even a greater uncertainty around the future of the demand shapes. So that means that the system is going to be spending even less time around the average price that we forecast through models, and there's going to be more time that we have prices that deviate from that average. For battery storage, this is critical. The volatility is not the noise, it is the product that we sell. So the question becomes, is the future electricity system increasingly shaped by those stress events, and how do we build a framework that forecasts those deviations? In Akaysha, we have an approach that we combine traditional forecasts with deterministic scenarios, but then on top of them, we apply probabilistic modeling that explicitly simulates those conditions. So let me show you how we do that. So when we go and do long-term modeling, we start with a similar structure with other consultants or developers as well. We have a small number of plausible transition scenarios. Each scenario represents a different pathway for the energy transition that is driven by policy settings, generation build-out, and the timing of coal retirements. And since many times our energy world seems like a battle of galactic forces, we have named our scenarios accordingly. So the first one represents a faster and more orderly transition. We call that the Jedi scenario. Here the force is balanced and renewable and storage capacity is built ahead of coal retirements. And that creates periods of oversupply and generally softer price outcomes. Then we have the Republic scenario. This is our central case. Like most Republic democracies, progress does happen, but there is negotiation, compromise, and incremental change. It goes a bit slower. This generally represents what we do expect now based on current policy settings. Then we have the Empire scenario. It represents a more disorderly transition where renewable deployment is slower, coal stays for longer, and then retires in clusters. And in other words, the dark forces of scarcity and system stress take over, leading to tighter supply and significantly higher price volatility. Traditionally, each of these scenarios would produce a single deterministic price trajectory, but in Akaysha, we treat those scenarios as the starting point rather than the final answer. Under each scenario, we then run large sets of probabilistic simulations by varying key parameters that actually drive volatility in real systems. So typically, those include different demand shapes like P10 and P90 conditions, historical and synthetic reference years in order to be able to capture more wind droughts or more solar insolation, and different hydro inflows as well. We also test critical sensitivities that can act like binary levels for prices for specific years. Those are, for example, the timing of Snowy 2.0 or major offshore wind investments. In order to build credible probabilistic simulations, we must ensure a few things. Firstly, the input parameters reflect realistic operating ranges that are observed in the market. Second, the sampling preserves correlations between weather and demand, which is critical for capturing the real system stress events. Third, transmission constraints are modeled accurately, so we capture locational price effects that increasingly drive value in the NEM specifically for storage. We won't be able to have all those details without IMO providing amazing data that we haven't been able to find in every other market apart from Australia. Finally, the models are calibrated against historical market behavior. So bidding and how usually participants are behaving, it's being calibrated into our modeling. So this combination turns those probabilistic simulations into decision-grade insights rather than just abstract modeling exercises. It also helps us identify where the major risks are, but also where the major opportunities lie. To give you an example, in most cases and in most modeling, we do see that New South Wales structurally is expected to have higher prices and more volatility than other states in the future because of a higher load. But when we start stress testing the system and we delay Snowy 2 for a bit longer, the VNI upgrade maybe a bit longer, and then we also think that there might be some delays in offshore wind, then Victoria seems to be having some issues and some problems with volatility in the medium term. All those dynamics are things that deterministic forecast cannot reveal. And for assets like battery storage, this is where all the value is created. In addition to the long-term modeling, we also spend a lot of time and putting a lot of emphasis to medium-term modeling for the next 1 to 3 years. So this horizon is particularly important for us because this is where many commercial and operational decisions are being made, including portfolio risk management, contract negotiations, budgeting, trading, and maintenance planning. So the modeling approach is slightly different from the long-term modeling because for the next 1 to 3 years, the system capacity is largely known, so we have one less thing to model. The generation fleet, the major network upgrades, and most of the committed projects are already visible. So that means that the emphasis shifts away from some of the structural uncertainty and toward the operational uncertainty. So in particular, we focus more on weather. We're doing more different modeling around weather variability, more in fluctuations in demand, and also we put a lot of effort on thermal generator outage patterns, and also the interactions between all those factors. So using these probabilistic simulations, we can generate a large ensemble of possible system states, and that allows us to observe how the price volatility can emerge under the different combinations. This provides a probabilistic view of market outcomes rather than a deterministic forecast. For battery storage operators, this is especially valuable because the revenue profile is driven more by the frequency and severity of those volatility events than any price average level. So the key question for us is not just what the expected price is, but how often the market conditions will create value outside those averages. At this point, the natural question is, how do we use that modeling? How does that translate into decisions? So at Akaysha, we apply the framework across two main layers: for investment decisions and for operational strategy. So on the investment side, the probabilistic simulations allows us to move away from relying on one price, and instead we analyze those distributions, and across multiple possible system conditions, we evaluate downside risk, understand where the volatility is likely to emerge, in which state, and identify which projects remain resilient under different scenarios and which are at high risk. It also helps us identify where storage captures the highest structural value, and particularly in locations where renewable penetration and thermal retirements interact with each other. On the operational side, the modeling helps us understand the probability and timing of volatility event in the short term. So that information feeds directly into bidding strategies, hedging structures, and portfolio management decisions. For example, understanding the probability distribution of price spikes helps us evaluate what is our cap exposure, our merchant position, and also the tolling structures we should go in. Ultimately, the objective is to stop thinking about the market as a single expected future and instead manage assets against a range of possible futures. So, to close, I want to step back and look at how energy market forecasting is evolving, at least for us as an investor, asset owner, and operator of battery storage. So, historically, the industry has focused, as I said, on single-point deterministic forecasts that effectively produce one plausible expected future based on average system conditions. That approach is moving volatility and rely heavily on historical behavior and provide limited visibility on downside risk or extreme events. Where we are moving today is toward this probabilistic modeling, where we simulate a wide range of possible futures. Something like that allows us to capture the probability of distributions of outcomes and explicitly model volatility and understand how sensitive the results that we have are to changes to the key inputs. Importantly, it also allows us to identify the specific drivers of those extreme market outcomes, which are often where a large share of value is created. However, this approach today is still constrained in practice. The scale of simulations, the resolution of data, and the speed of execution are still limited by compute, hardware, and data availability. So the next frontier is about removing all those constraints. This enables us not to just do better modeling, but to continue recalibrate and interpret the probabilistic outcomes. At that point, the forecasting will become less about predicting a single outcome and more about continuously positioning for a wide range of possible futures. And that is where the real competitive advantage will sit. To finish, let me leave you with one final thought. In a system defined by uncertainty, value will not come from predicting that future, but from being consistently positioned to capture it. I'll pause there and take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, very insightful panels. On the probabilistic modelling, so what do you use for weather/climate modelling long term? Because I mean, I dare say the bomb is reasonably good for the next 24 hours. The skill massively drops off after 10 days, and you're modelling 30-year forecasts. So,
yeah. So for long term, we are still using. And we do think that whatever we have from AEMO regarding long-term demand forecasting is the best available information that we can use for our models long-term. Having said that, I also mentioned that we are putting some synthetic demand traces there. This is because, again, having all that different information for the demand shapes, we can deconstruct those demand shapes and therefore have different information and different inputs. What is the EV profile, for example, or what is the data center impact? So the starting point for long term is AEMO's projections using ISO modeling, but then we do on top of that, overlay some of our assumptions if we think that we should be doing that to stress test the system. For shorter term, for the next 1 to 3 years, we are developing some of our own demand forecasts. We still are not in a place that we will be using that for our internal modeling as well, but we do think that there is a lot of value to actually try and develop something which is a lot more accurate, and the starting point is a lot more accurate from what we are giving from AEMO. So we are in that front, trying to get a bit ahead of the curve on that demand forecasting. But we already are seeing a lot of value on just using the reference years that we have. We do have now 12, 13 reference years, so you can certainly capture a lot of those things, but we do see a lot of value, especially for the next week or for the next couple of weeks, to actually develop those capabilities of deviating from what you're getting from publicly available data.
Thanks for that. Just a question on you mentioned around making sure that you capture the coincidence between the demand and the renewable or the weather data. How do you go about ensuring that you're doing that as part of your modelling? What approach do you take to making sure that you capture that relationship?
Again, making sure that the reference years that you use and the traces that you use are coincidental and they are from the same reference years is very important. We do not mix and match. I have seen that happening in order to skew or to average and smooth prices. So regarding demand, solar and wind, reference years is the most important thing. In the short term, again, what we are developing regarding demand, it's always weather dependent, so there's going to be coincidence in the short term. It is a lot more important on how you be able to bring that coincidence as well with different policy scenarios. So to give you an example, we do, again, using data on how older coal generators start to increase having more outages as they age. So the last 10 years, going into that bathtub of how much they will need is coincidental more peaks, and this tends to be even when you need it more in the middle of a summer in many cases. So we do try, when we do stress tests, to create some of that coincidence with power outages as well.
Thanks so much for the presentation. Interested to know more about how you integrate and calibrate between your medium-term forecasts and your long-term forecasts. I know they have kind of different objectives, but obviously as you're moving kind of steps and making more abstractions, it's be interested to kind of see what challenges you see and how you approach them.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. There are different reasons why we do use the long-term modeling. So typically when we do the long-term modeling, this is for 3 to 6 months, unless there is something big like a war that can, change a lot of those assumptions. So for the long-term modeling, we do keep those a bit more stable, those forecasts. And while for the medium, it's probably something that we do try to do even on a monthly basis. Now, everything that comes out of the medium-term forecasting and we think it's credible to be using, it feeds into the long-term as well. But I will say that there is a lot more emphasis when we do the medium term on every single detail that can create those short-term volatility, while in the long term we're actually looking more on the structural volatility and prices across the main levers. So the latest medium-term modeling will always feed into our long-term, but I'm not going to say that we'll be changing every single time, because it's not the reason why we have those two different models.